Okay, let's get right to it. We're going to be conducting a tactical analysis of the naval transport operation directed at Cartagena in March of 1939. This operation involved two key vessels, the Castillo de Olite and the Castillo de Peñafiel. They were carrying a combined force of nearly 4,000 troops. Now, by the end of this operation, one of those ships would be at the bottom of the sea, and the other would have a truly harrowing story of survival. So let's break down exactly what happened during this pivotal moment of the Spanish Civil War. And just for the record, all of the information for this briefing, our entire analytical framework, is based on the meticulous work found at batallasguerracivil.es. This is a project by Colonel F.J. Victor Rodrigo of the Spanish Army, which gives us a detailed, factual account of these events. All right, here's our agenda. First, we'll start with the operation briefing out of Castellan, setting the stage for the mission. From there, we'll get into the tragic fate of the Castillo de Olite. Then we'll shift focus to the incredible odyssey of its sister ship, the Castillo de Peñafiel, and its fight to survive. And finally, we'll wrap up with an after-action report looking at the key outcomes. Okay, let's begin where the operation kicked off, the port of Castellón. This is all about the mission's inception and the composition of the force. So right here in Castellón, you have almost 4,000 troops embarking on these two transport ships. But the mission had two massive and, as it turns out, fatal flaws right from the get-go. First, these ships had absolutely no naval escort. And second, and this is the real kicker, they had no radios. They were essentially sailing completely blind and totally alone. The first vessel to depart was the Castillo de Olite. It left in the morning carrying over 1,900 soldiers. But it's the second departure that becomes crucial to this story. The Castillo de Peñafiel didn't get underway until 1600 hours, late in the afternoon. That's almost a 6-hour delay behind its sister ship. And believe me, that time gap is going to make all the difference. And now we're going to follow the Castillo de Olite as it steams toward Cartagena, completely, utterly unaware of the disaster that's waiting for it. As the Olite neared its destination, a really thick fog rolled in. Now remember, no radio. The captain was sailing blind in every sense of the word, and he made a critical, fatal assumption that friendly forces had already secured the port. So, thinking he was sailing into a safe harbor, he steered his ship, which was packed with nearly 2,000 men, directly into a prepared kill zone. So here's the chronological breakdown of how it all fell apart. At 1100 hours, the Olite spots a landmark through the fog. Thinking everything's fine, they proceed directly toward the port. Then, a light caliber cannon opens up on them. It's basically a warning shot. The captain panics and reverses course, which was the worst possible move he could have made. He turns his ship directly into the sights of the main coastal battery, La Patajola. It fires just 4 shells. The third and fourth shells hit home. That last one strikes a makeshift ammunition storage area, and the ship just disintegrates. It sinks almost instantly. Just like that, 1,200 men were gone, either killed in the massive explosion or lost to the sea. About 700 survivors were pulled from the water, but they weren't rescued by friendly forces. They were picked up by local civilians and the very same enemy troops who had just sunk their ship. For them, the ordeal was far from over. They were now prisoners of war. But here's an absolutely incredible twist to the story. According to a diary from one of the battalions, these captured survivors didn't just sit out the rest of the fight. As the city's defenses began to collapse, they actually helped seize Cartagena from the inside. For this unbelievable turn of events, these survivors were later awarded the Collective Laureate Cross, one of Spain's highest military honors. So while the Olite met its tragic end, its sister ship, the Castillo de Peñafiel, was sailing into its own nightmare, but with a very, very different outcome. Remember that 6-hour delay we talked about? Well, it meant the Peñafiel arrived long after the element of surprise was gone. So instead of a quiet approach, it sailed right into an ambush. The ship was immediately hammered by attacks from both the air and coastal batteries, turning its journey into a desperate running gunfight. And the attacks were relentless. They just kept coming. For hours, the Peñafiel was under constant assault. First, you had waves of enemy aircraft. Then the coastal cannons opened fire on them. The final blow was a coordinated, simultaneous attack by 7 aircraft at once, strafing the decks and dropping bombs. It was just nonstop. So the big question is, how did they survive this? Well, an official telegram tells an amazing story of sheer resilience. The troops on board effectively turned that transport ship into a warship. They fought back with every machine gun and rifle they had. When cannon shells tore 2 holes in the hull right at the waterline, they didn't panic. They went down into the cargo hold, grabbed sacks of cement, and literally plugged the breaches to keep the ship from sinking. And incredibly, it worked. The ship not only survived, but also claimed to have shot down 5 enemy aircraft before it finally limped to safety in Ibiza. All right, so when all the smoke cleared, what was the final assessment? Let's get into the after-action report. Look, let's be blunt. The primary objective was not achieved. The mission was a failure. The amphibious landing at Cartagena was completely aborted. You have the total loss of the Olite and the catastrophic casualties that went with it. The Peñafiel survived, sure, but it was heavily damaged. And the key factor, the reason for this whole disaster, really boils down to one critical thing: a total failure of intelligence and communication. The Olite sailed into a trap simply because its captain had no idea what was waiting for him. If you want to dive deeper into the operational details, the full record is available at batallasguerracivil.es. You know, the story of these 2 ships is a stark reminder of a timeless lesson in warfare. You can have thousands of well-trained soldiers and tons of equipment, but without communication, without knowing what's just over the horizon, you're sailing blind. And, as we've seen, sometimes that leads directly to disaster.